Today I want to violate one of the main rules. Can you all hear me well? Okay, wonderful. I want to make sure with this microphone I don't wander away from it inadvertently. I want to violate one of the key rules of doing a PhD, and that is not to talk about your dissertation. Apparently this is a major faux pas that PhD students commit, and that is talking about their dissertation all the time. And sometimes people ask you, you're doing this PhD, what are you writing about? And then you misinterpret that question as an actual honest inquiry into what you're writing about. And then you start talking about it for 5 minutes, and then you realize the person is in this semi-sleepy state and actually trying to escape from you, and then you realize I shouldn't have answered that question. But I promise you I will not divulge all the details of the various technicalities that I'm attempting to hash out in my work. But I think that what I am trying to do in my work is very valuable, and I think there's a gospel message in the idea of the Sabbath that I would like to convey. Some people ask me, what are you as a Seventh-day Adventist doing a PhD at the biggest, baddest Jesuit university in the United States? What's the point of that? And I tell them, well, what does a Seventh-day Adventist do when he or she goes to a Jesuit university? You tell them about the Sabbath. And so that's what I'm trying to do. I was actually asked to do that by my dissertation director, Miguel Diaz. He's formerly the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. So he's kind of at the top of, well, not the top of the Catholic hierarchy, that's the Pope, but very much up there. And I wrote a paper for him, and he said, you have to do your dissertation. Why don't you do it on the Sabbath? And I had never thought about that before. I thought, write on something more lofty and intellectual, something in liberation theology or the doctrine of atonement, something more sophisticated. And he said, no, you should write on the Sabbath. And I said, well, okay, you told me to. So I'm trying to talk about the gospel of the Sabbath. By way of introduction to the notion of the Sabbath as gospel, which is usually those are not two terms that we conjoin together. We talk about the gospel, and many times when we have evangelistic series, you preach a series of sermons on Adventism and on prophecies and so forth, you usually start with the gospel or something akin to it. And I've done this before in the evangelistic series that I've preached. And then somewhere along the line, maybe towards the end, maybe if you have 14 or 15 nights sermons on various themes, you work your way around to the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is this key distinctive truth that you want to build up to. And I think that can work, but I sometimes feel like the Sabbath is really part of the gospel. And we have this term, seventh day, in our name as Adventists. And some of you may be aware that there were individuals in the early founding days of Adventism who thought that a different name might be appropriate. And Ellen White and others in the pioneer group of members of our church said, no, Seventh-day Adventist is important because it signals to the world that distinctive element of who we are that is so vital and so important. It's something we want everyone to know. We are Seventh-day Adventists. And I think the seventh-day part of our name is crucial, and I think it's not just a quirk in our identity. It's not something that just makes us a little bit weird and maybe different from other Christian groups. I think it's integral to the gospel itself. But there's so much about the Sabbath that I know, I must confess, I did not understand growing up as a Seventh-day Adventist. I think about it as similar to my experience that I had here in Chicago. I've been here for about 3 years. And during those 3 years, I would go throughout the city of Chicago, and I would look at the various sites. I haven't seen much of Chicago, actually. I feel bad. I've kind of been confined to my little corner of Rogers Park and haven't gone that far. But I would always see this flag. And there are many flags in the city of Chicago, and I would see this flag, and it was blue and white, and it had these stars on it. And I thought, Chicago is great because it's a city of immigrants, and that's one of the wonderful things about it. You can meet people from everywhere and see all different types of food and clothing and music, and it's just a wonderful, diverse experience. And I thought, this is probably a flag of some country that I don't even know, I don't know all the flags of the world. This is probably, you know, it looked kind of like Greece, kind of like Argentina. I was like, maybe, what flag is this? And I didn't really think about it. I just assumed it was a flag I didn't understand and just kept on going. But I saw it everywhere. And just a couple months ago, actually, I think it was a few weeks ago, I was at a music event with a friend of mine from North Shore. And there was a big version of this flag right behind the front of the auditorium. And I leaned over and I said, what is that flag there? I've seen that everywhere. And he looked at me and with this incredulous look, and he said, that's the Chicago flag. How did you not know that was the Chicago flag? And I said, Chicago has a flag? I had never considered that this might be the flag of Chicago. It was everywhere, and I was just assuming it was some country that I had never seen before or seen its flag before. And sometimes that happens in all dimensions of our life, including our faith. There are things that are right in front of us all the time, perhaps, or at least regularly, and we never bother to think about them or ask questions about them, and so we never come to a deeper understanding of what they mean. And I think the same thing is true of the Sabbath. Sabbath is something that is part of being an Adventist, and if you grow up in the Adventist church or if you've been an Adventist for a long time, you've kept Sabbath and you've seen other people keeping Sabbath. And speaking only for myself, I know that growing up, I never really inquired into it that much. I simply thought, God tells us to keep the Sabbath. Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. We should keep the Sabbath. That's it. And that was all the thinking I did about it. And it was only recently that I started looking into the meaning of the Sabbath, and I realized there is all kinds of wonderful, profound truths in this cherished doctrine of the Sabbath that we don't think about enough. And so I just want to look at two of those today under the category of gospel, because I think the Sabbath is gospel. It is good news for us. And I want to just show you two dimensions of what that good news means. Just to begin, I'd just like you to look at Mark 2:27. You don't have to turn to all of these verses that I have here because that could take us a while, and I don't want to go long into the afternoon. Mark 2:27 is a verse that I'm sure you've heard as an Adventist. This is in the context of Jesus' healings, and we'll look in a short bit at another one of Jesus' healings that I think is very illuminating with regard to the Sabbath. But it says, Jesus speaking, "The Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath." I'd heard that verse growing up, but its obvious meaning never struck me. The Sabbath was made for you and me. It is a gift of God to us. Many times I had thought of the Sabbath as something that I do for God, or I fulfill as a religious obligation, a duty, a responsibility. But if you look at this verse, its meaning is clear. God gave us the Sabbath. God wants us to appreciate this gift. And so I'm going to say there are two dimensions to this gift, this act of giving that is inherent in the Sabbath that often get overlooked. The first one is that on the Sabbath, God gives us rest. I'd like you to look at Genesis 2:1-3. Once again, another verse that I'm sure you have seen before or heard before. This is the first mention of the Sabbath in the entire Bible. This is right after creation. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. On the seventh day, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day from all the work he had undertaken. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he had rested from all the work he had done in creation." Just for a moment, try to picture yourself in the footsteps, I was going to say in the shoes, but they may not have been wearing shoes, in the footsteps of Adam and Eve. You've just been created, just formed out of the dust of the earth and a rib, if you're Eve. And what is the first thing you do as a human being, created in the image of God? I can easily imagine someone who has created something, immediately wanting to put it to work. You're created, given certain powers, certain energies. Go to work, use them, get something done. Tend this garden. But that's not what happens. God creates human beings as almost the pinnacle of creation. If all the days add up toward a final climax, the 6 days right before the seventh, God creates human beings. And God doesn't say, okay, guys, time to go to work. God says, rest. And I think there's something very profoundly moving in that idea that God creates us not to be producers, not to be machines, but to rest in God's presence. We live in a society that values production, probably more than anything else. We often value ourselves on the basis of what we produce and what we get done. If you ever go to a party or a dinner event with some people that you vaguely know, often this happens, especially if you're younger, if you're in your 20s and you're just getting started in your career, or you just finished college, and you visit some relatives that you may know vaguely, some distant cousins. One of the first things that can be awkward that they ask you is, what do you do? And if you haven't fully figured out your career yet, it can be kind of awkward because you want to answer that question in a way that makes it sound like you're being productive, but yet you're really not where you want to be yet. That's the question that we use to put people in boxes, in categories, and to figure out how important they are to our society. What do you do? What do you produce? What do you make? What have you done with your life? Many times, speaking from an academic context, we value people in academia on the basis of how much they've published, how many degrees they've accomplished. And sometimes I'll look at my life and I'll think, if I can just get this PhD done, then I'll have a sense of value because I've made something. I have put something on my resume, my CV. I am an accomplished, valuable person. But the good news of the Sabbath, the gospel, is God does not value you on the basis of what you produce. The people in your life, your acquaintances, they may only think of you as a machine, as a robot that functions to get things done, to take input and turn it into output. But God does not look at us that way. God says, your value is to be in my presence, to rest in my love for you. That's the meaning of Sabbath. You see, we do not work in order to have rest as a facilitator for more work. The philosopher Aristotle, back in ancient Greece, said that rest is necessary simply in order to do more work. You have to take a break because if you work constantly, your productivity will go down. And employers have figured this out. They've said, we need to give our employees rest. Places like Google, they have bean bags supposedly in Silicon Valley and these fancy offices so that their employees can relax because that way they get more work done. And sometimes we internalize this mentality that rest is simply for the purpose of more work. But that's not how God's creativity works. God doesn't say that Sabbath is just necessary so that you can get more stuff done. God says work is for the purpose of Sabbath. The 6 days of the week build up to Sabbath, not the other way around. Sabbath is being in the presence of God, and that is the meaning of life. That is what gives us value. That is what gives us purpose. And that is the good news of the Sabbath. Someone might ask, why does God command us to observe the Sabbath? If the Sabbath is a gift, right, which is what I'm trying to communicate here, if the Sabbath is something that God gives us, why does God say, you must keep the Sabbath? It almost sounds like a strange contradiction or paradox. It's like if a parent were to give a child a gift, like a toy, and then say, you must play with that toy. That wouldn't seem to make sense, right? The toy is a gift. It's not something that you give somebody and then harass them about using, right? So why does God command us to observe the Sabbath? Is the Sabbath arbitrary? This is another question that often comes up. Why is the seventh day particularly so important? Why can't we just keep Sabbath on any day that we like? In order to answer that question, and I think there is an important answer that we have to find, we have to internalize, because many people that hear about our message of the Sabbath may be tempted to think that we are advocating an image of an arbitrary God who is sitting up in heaven saying they need to keep the Sabbath on the right day, and if they keep it on the wrong day, I will send them to the hot place. We have this image of God who's just petty and persnickety and all up in arms about which day we keep. But I think there's an important reason why the seventh-day Sabbath that God commanded us to observe is so important. I'd like you to think about a time when you have been given a responsibility or a task that nobody is supervising you to complete. This is actually the case with me with my dissertation. Here I am talking about my dissertation again. Nobody is making me write my dissertation. And it's awkward because, all throughout your education, even when you go to college, you have professors who are kind of hounding you, saying, this is due at this point, you have this assignment tomorrow, get it done, and you have deadlines, and you have injunctions to be productive. But then you get to a point in life where sometimes there are things that you have to do, like write a dissertation, and nobody is supervising you. You're kind of self-employed in a sense. And this may be true also for those of you who have jobs where you are self-employed. Maybe you own your own business. And nobody is above you saying, this is what you need to do. Often in those circumstances, other people will take advantage of your time. And I'm sure you can think about an example when this has probably happened to you. You have a very important thing that you want to accomplish, and maybe you tell yourself, I want this to be done by Tuesday. And then Monday night, your friends call you up and say, hey, we really want to go to the beach, hang out, have some food. You want to come? And you think to yourself, I wanted to get this project done by Tuesday. And then you say, I've got to get this project done by tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And your friends say, who says so? And then you think to yourself, well, I do. I really want to get this done. Your friends say, you can postpone that till later. And I found in my life, at least in my own experience, that if you are your own boss and you are your own authority for getting things done, very rarely do things actually get done. Sometimes procrastination becomes an overwhelming force in your life. And I think this is the case with the Sabbath, because Sabbath is something that our society, our culture, and various cultures throughout history will try to take from you very viciously. Rest is not easy to come by, and this is the whole experience that Israel had in Egypt. Moses said, let my people go, speaking for God. Let my people go worship me in the desert. And Pharaoh did not want to let them go. And this is not just something that happened in Egypt. This is something that recurs throughout our experience. People will try to control us. Our society will try to fit us into this mold of producing, of making things happen, of being a machine, a robot, as I said. And this is not the image that we are supposed to fulfill as people made in the image of God. We are supposed to rest in God's presence. And so God says, I will command you to observe the Sabbath, because that's the only way you will get to experience the joy of Sabbath. Because there are those out there who will try to stop you from Sabbath keeping. And it's only by appealing to the authority of God, which in a sense seems arbitrary, that real Sabbath rest consistently can happen. Another thing that makes God's commanding the Sabbath to us important is the simple fact that sometimes we feel guilty about rest. I don't know if you've had this experience, but also, once again, with regard to projects like dissertations, a dissertation kind of hangs over you if you're doing an independent project like that, and you can't seem to get away from it. Even now, as I was coming to church this morning, riding on my bike, I was thinking, man, I should have written that extra page yesterday. It's something you can't get away from. And sometimes, because we live in this capitalist society where we are always urged to produce, to get things done, we can't rest. Our consciences won't let us rest. We're always thinking about stuff we should be doing. And so the good news of the Sabbath is that God comes along and says, I know you won't be able to give yourself rest. You will want to work because you will feel compelled to work. And so I'm going to tell you to rest because that's what you need. You will not realize the meaning of life unless I tell you rest. So many people spend their lives in constant, frantic activity, moving from one thing to the next, filling up every waking hour. We see this with high school students and even younger. Parents fill up their kids' schedules with things. They have soccer practice, they have band practice, they have this event, this book club, and so on, especially once they get later into high school and they're trying to get into a good college and they need all these different things as background experience to put on their list of accomplishments. And you can meet people who have gone through their lives frenetically trying to get things done and never thinking about where they're going. And in this kind of culture, in this society, God steps in and says, I have good news for you. You need to rest. Not just rest so that you can keep doing more stuff, but rest in my presence. Appreciate my goodness. Appreciate the meaning of life, which is not just being a producer. It's being in the presence of God. So the first point about God's good news of the Sabbath is that God gives us rest. But there's another element to Sabbath. And I think that first point about God giving us rest is something that we can appreciate as Adventists. It's something we're open to. We like the Sabbath. We like enjoying our personal rest with God. But the Sabbath is not just about me personally getting my fulfillment with God, although it is. It's also about giving rest to others. In order to see what this means, go to that verse that we read as part of the scripture reading, Deuteronomy 5. I chose Deuteronomy 5 because it is the second repeating of the Ten Commandments. We usually read Exodus 20, which is the first version, but there is a second version, and that is in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy literally means second law, Deuteronomos in Greek. And this version is a little bit different. It's not contradictory to the Exodus 20 version if you were to compare them side by side, but it is a little bit different, and I think the difference is important because it gets at this second aspect of the gift of the Sabbath, which is that it is a gift we give to others as well. And I'm going to read it again. And notice, if you remember the first version in Exodus 20, if we had time, we could literally go back and compare them, but it's getting into the afternoon, so I don't want to do that. It says, observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, either you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, or any work animal, or the resident alien within your gates, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you too were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Just to refresh your memory, the Exodus version has exactly the same commandment, but a slightly different rationale, a very different rationale, actually. It says, you should observe the Sabbath day because in 6 days the Lord your God made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. But in this version it says, remember the Sabbath day because there was a time when you did not have the privilege of Sabbath. You were in Egypt, you were slaving away at Pharaoh's projects, you were working constantly, you were being treated as a cog in the machine. You did not have the privilege of rest. Therefore, I have given you rest. This is the logic in the passage. Therefore, you should give rest to other people working for you. Notice, your son or your daughter, people within your household, as well as the resident alien or the immigrant, any male or female slave that you happen to have, as well as nature. Notice it mentions the animals there, your ox or donkey, or any work animal. You should give rest to others because I have given you rest. That's the logic of the commandment. And this is tricky because many times, as I said, we as Adventists, we stop at the notion of God giving us rest, which is something we like. We like to get rest. But God says that's not Sabbath keeping in its entirety. Not only should you receive rest, you should give it to other people. What does this mean? Let's turn to John 5, 1 through 17. This will be the last verse that I promise we'll turn to. This is the story of Jesus' healing on the Sabbath. And there are many stories of Jesus doing healings on the Sabbath and getting into conflict with the authorities at the temple for doing so. And I'll read it quickly. It's about a man who was in a fairly desperate state. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This is verse 1 of John chapter 5. Verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem at the sheep gate a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, with 5 porticos. In these lay a large number of ill, blind, lame, and crippled. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been ill for a long time, he said to him, do you want to be well? The sick man answered him, sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm only on my way, someone else gets down there before me. Jesus said to him, rise, take up your mat, and walk. Immediately the man became well, took up his mat, and walked. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who was cured, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to carry your mat. He answered them, the man who made me well told me, take up your mat and walk. They asked him, who is the man who told you, take it up and walk? The man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away since there was a crowd there. After this, Jesus found him in the temple area and said to him, look, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse may happen to you. The man went and told the Jews that Jesus was the one who had made him well. Therefore the Jews began to persecute Jesus because he did this on a Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is at work until now, so I am at work. I want you to zero in on that last verse, verse 17. This is Jesus' explanation, one of his explanations, for why he's healing people on the Sabbath. He says, my Father is perpetually at work. He's been at work until now, and I am imitating my Father. Which raises this very interesting theological question. Does God keep the Sabbath? Of course, we have to say the answer is yes. Yes, God keeps the Sabbath. We keep the Sabbath because God kept the Sabbath, right? Right after creation. We are modeling God. So why does Jesus say, my Father is at work on the Sabbath, therefore I am at work? It must be that the type of work that Jesus is doing, the type of work that God does, that Jesus emulates, is what it means for God to keep Sabbath. And what is that? Jesus is going around healing people, restoring people, giving people rest on the Sabbath day. This man who had been ill for 38 years, Jesus decides to step in and provide him rest. That's what God does on the Sabbath. That's what Jesus does. And that is what we, as fellow Sabbath keepers with God, should be doing. It's not enough for us just to receive the gift of rest. We have to keep Sabbath by bringing that rest to other people, by healing people spiritually, mentally, and physically. Recently, somebody asked me, a professional nurse over at North Shore, asked me, what do you think about my working at the hospital on Sabbath as a nurse? And I told him, I think that's wonderful. It's not only Sabbath keeping, it's in a sense Jesus' form of Sabbath keeping. You're providing that healing and that rest to people who need it. Sabbath keeping is not just sitting and doing nothing. Sometimes we have to do that. But it's more. It's taking that gift of fellowship, of resting in God's presence, and spreading it to others. There are many people in our world who do not have rest. Recently, I discovered, well, I'd known vaguely this for a while, but there are people in the world who, in order to survive, have to work 7 days a week for long shifts. And in a certain sense, these people are working for me. It sounds kind of strange to say that. But if you have clothing, well, you all have clothing, obviously, and you take out your clothes in your drawer, don't do it now, obviously, you'd have to turn your neck around. Look at the tags on that clothing and look at where it was produced. Some of the clothes you have probably were made in the United States, but the vast majority were made probably in places such as Bangladesh, Thailand, India, or China. And especially in places such as Bangladesh and Thailand, workers are paid very, very low wages. This is why it's actually good business for companies based in the United States to have clothes made way over on the other side of the world. It doesn't really make sense if you stop and think about it. Why would you have your clothes made on the other side of the world and then shipped all the way back to the place where they're sold? That doesn't seem to have any logic to it. But it's good business because those countries are extremely poor and companies can pay them very, very low wages, exploitative wages actually, and make a humongous profit. And so sometimes you'll see clothes in a store, very nice clothes, and they're $5, $10, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, how is it possible that something of this quality or of this ornateness could cost this much? And then you realize this was made by someone who maybe was earning $1 a day or $1 an hour perhaps at best, and someone who very likely had to work 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we can think about this, those of us, such as myself, living comfortably here in the United States, buying clothes, and we can say, you know, that's too bad, but they should still keep the Sabbath. Maybe they will have to go out in faith and decide to tell their boss, I'm not going to work on the seventh day. But the problem is, their boss will likely fire them because there are a line of other people wanting to do the job that that person is doing. And we can say, oh, it's their responsibility, it's that person's job to follow God's command to keep the Sabbath day. But if part of Sabbath rest is giving rest to others, we have to ask ourselves, how can we confront this kind of situation? And it may impact the way that we shop. And I've become convicted lately that I have to address the types of things that I buy as part of my Sabbath keeping, because I cannot participate knowingly in a system of exploitation that harms other people and then call myself a Sabbath keeper. I recently looked at Revelation 13. We won't go there. You probably are familiar with the passage in Revelation 13 that talks about the beast power that causes all who follow the beast to receive a mark, an image, the mark of the beast. And we as Adventists have typically understood that to be an anti-Sabbath, in a sense, the mark of the beast, because the seal of God is the sign of God's true people, which is the Sabbath, and therefore the beast power that arises at the end of time forges this mark, this anti-Sabbath practice that therefore competes with God's true Sabbath. And it says there in Revelation 13 that all who would not receive the mark could not buy or sell. And I was thinking to myself, could it be that we will not be able to buy or sell, not because we are forbidden from doing so, but because we refuse to buy or sell the types of exploitative things that will occur even more so at the end of time in our world? These are questions we have to ask ourselves, because Sabbath is not just about our doing our own private practices. It's about our giving rest to other people. I heard a story recently from here in the United States about a woman named Maria Fernandez who was in Newark, New Jersey. And she had a family. She was trying to support her family. She was working 4 jobs on different days. And she only had 4 hours in between each job. And so what she would do is she would go to work one job for an 8-hour shift. Then she would go out to her car, sleep for a couple hours, get up, go to the next job, work an 8-hour shift, sleep for a couple hours, repeat, on and on and on. So one night she was in her car, and because it was cold, she had to have the windows shut, and she had to have heat, and she sometimes would run out of gas, so she kept a container of fuel in the back of her car. The container of fuel spilled over, and the fumes confined to the car killed her. They found her there in her car, dead. Dead from overwork. And I thought about that story and the tragedy of that, and I said to myself, who is responsible for the death of Maria Fernandez? And I realized it's a society that does not give rest to people. And too often I hear stories about people who have made it in the world, maybe who have started their own business or who have accomplished some great thing, and they'll talk about how, I worked for 80 hours a week, and I never had rest, and finally I made it. And everyone else can do that too. And I thought to myself, that's a very macho Spartan mentality, let's work and get things done and be almost self-destructive in our urge to be productive. And I realized that's not the type of economy, that's not the type of culturally appropriate lifestyle that God wants for us. And it's not the type of lifestyle and culture that we as Adventists should propagate. We should strive to foster an economy in our world, in our political interactions, in which we give rest to other people. And that will change the way, as I said, we shop. It may change the way we even vote. It may change the way that we interact as employers toward our employees. It can change our entire outlook throughout the 6 days of the week that build up to Sabbath, because Sabbath is not just something that happens on Saturday, although it does. Sabbath is a mentality, it is a lifestyle that ought to trickle into the rest of our existence, because we are, after all, Seventh-day Adventists. Just recently, last week, I was thinking about what does it mean to give rest to the world? And I was working with Epic Church, which is another one of our partner churches. Epic Church is down in Wicker Park. And I sometimes go and assist them with projects, whatever they need, just as I try to go and assist, Pastor Zoroslav and Pastor Malenko. And so I went down to help them with an outreach project they were doing at Wicker Park Fest. And this was an outreach ministry called Free Hugs. Basically, they have a booth, and they hold a sign. We were holding signs that say free hugs to those people who go to Wicker Park Fest just to enjoy the Sunday afternoon. And there's something I discovered in doing that is just absolutely amazing in terms of its effect on you. Researchers have shown that giving a hug elevates your mood. It is literally like an antidepressant or like a drug. And I had heard that before, and I thought, oh yeah, hugs are great, they're fantastic. But after a full afternoon of just giving hugs to people, it was astounding what happened to me psychologically. I just suddenly thought to myself, I am in the best mood ever. It was literally, I had not taken any drugs, I promise you. I felt like I was having a high. There was just something about it. It was amazing. And the great thing about it also is that unlike pharmaceuticals, there was no come down. It was just a wonderful, great feeling of being embraced by other people. And I started to think to myself, a hug is kind of like a micro Sabbath in a sense. It's being in someone's presence. It's kind of pointless in a way, just embracing somebody. There's nothing that you accomplish through that. There's no production really through that process. It's just resting in another's presence. And I thought about that afternoon, and I thought about all the people who were walking by who didn't want to receive hugs. And of course, various people have different reasons for, personal space and not wanting to just hug a random stranger. And some of them probably had legitimate concerns about why somebody would be offering you a free hug. That just seems a little bit weird and awkward. But I think many of them, when they saw those signs, started to think to themselves, there must be a catch here. There must be a ulterior motive here, that somebody would just offer free hugs. That just doesn't seem right. And so many people missed out on the beauty of that experience, that free hug, because they couldn't believe the good news. That there is grace in the world. There is a gift of rest that God gives us and God wants us to give other people. And I feel like that's the way it is with the Sabbath. We have this message of God's gift of rest to us. And there are so many people here in Chicago who would love and need to hear that message, that good news. And it's up to us not to be embarrassed about the Sabbath, not to hide it, but to welcome others into its presence. God came to us and said, I have a gift for you. It's Sabbath rest. There's no catch. There's no ulterior motive. There's nothing except God's pure compassion that wants to welcome you into God's embrace. And so I challenge you as you go through this week, think to yourself, how can I more deeply appreciate God's gift of rest to me? But not only that, how can I give rest to someone else in my presence? One of our pastors here in Chicago, Pastor Jonathan Burnett, he gave an appeal in one of his sermons asking for every person to make a decision to go and eat with somebody you don't know during the week. And it's something that I've done also. It's a beautiful thing. Find someone that you don't know and just enjoy a meal with that person. Think of it as a micro Sabbath. Try to imagine various ways you can inject micro Sabbaths into your week. I did that recently with a guy named Victor, who I met on the street up in Rogers Park. And we had this terrific conversation where we talked about Paul. He was very interested in Romans 7. We went to Taco Bell and had a meal, and it was fantastic. And I was thinking to myself, this is the kind of world that God wants to create through the Adventist church. An experience, a culture in which we give rest to other people. Just in closing, recently, about 2 years ago, I went on a road trip with a couple of friends of mine. And of course, we were all students, and we were using one of their cars. I don't have a car, and so we were just all packed in this little vehicle and trying to save money. We were camping. We were going to California. And at one point, we were in Utah. And we didn't have a place to camp, and sometimes campsites cost money. And so one of our members in the group said, hey, let's call up the Adventist church and see if we can camp in their front lawn. I said, okay, why not? Doesn't hurt. So there was a little church. This is way out in the middle of the desert in Utah. We called up this pastor, and we said, hey, we're a bunch of students. We're going on a road trip. We're just wondering if we can camp in the lawn of your church, assuming they had a lawn. Sometimes they don't in the desert. And he said, he was an old guy. He's probably 80, 85, somewhere in there. He was actually almost a retired pastor. He said, you could, but why wouldn't you just come and stay at my house? We said, okay. And one of our members in the car was not a Seventh-day Adventist. He was vaguely familiar with Adventism. And he got this funny look on his face. He said, wait, we're just going to go and sleep at this guy's house. He said, yeah, it doesn't hurt. Let's try. So we went there, and he and his wife welcomed us into their home. They had multiple little cots in a room, like a guest room, and another bed. And they fed us this wonderful meal of fruit and home-cooked other items. And we enjoyed talking with them, and we slept in their basement there in that room, and we got up the next day. They gave us more food, and we chatted some more, and then we took off. And my friend, Jamie, who is not a Seventh-day Adventist, he just had this stunned feeling about him. He was like, how is this possible? Do Adventists normally do this? We said, this is the meaning of being an Adventist. Of course, there are many Adventists who would probably not do that, but he said, I want to become an Adventist. If this is the kind of people that Adventists are, this is the kind of group I want to be involved with. And of course, that was not on a Sabbath. But I wonder if we could make our Sabbaths rest-giving experiences. Not something, once again, that we would hide and curtail until the last part of an evangelistic series and then spring on people and say, you have to keep the Sabbath. But if we would put that at the forefront of our being, that we are people who give rest. What kind of an impact would that have on our neighbors? What would that do to the people of Chicago if they learned, those people at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, if you need rest, if you need welcoming arms, if you need hospitality, if you need compassion, go to those people. I wonder what an impact we would have on our city, on our nation, on our world. Thank you.